The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, bringing you another installment of my ongoing book club series, featuring a very special new edition of a long-neglected classic text, Gevaert's new treatise on instrumentation. I was approached earlier this year by translator and editor Davis Brown, who is himself a consummate composer and orchestrator, with the request that I look over his restoration of Gevaert's superb treatise and submit a foreword if I felt the effort merited it. And it does. Davis has done an incredible job of revivifying Gevaert's original thoughts and recommendations, putting them in context with generous notes and asides, and creating a new edition that can be studied by today's generation of orchestration enthusiasts. In fact, I found the rebooting of this text so significant and essential that I supplied a foreword that Davis's translation deserved, which turned out to be 3 times as long as his publishers could fit into the book. But that just made it all the easier to take my original text and share it with you in this video. I hope you enjoy it.
Thus, in Act 2 of Gluck's Armide, in the scene at the Enchanted River, the delightful flute ritornello, colored by the middle register's cool timbre, expresses voluptuous languor in which the hero's soul is overwhelmed amidst the seductions that the magician's art has strewn under his feet. The beauty of the countryside, the perfume of the flowers, the song of the birds, the dense shade, the soft grass.
Today's orchestration student stands upon a fundament of collected knowledge covering the theory and practice of orchestration, and its subset, instrumentation, going back to the Middle Ages. Even just starting from the mid-20th century forwards, various university texts and extended writings abound, suiting every taste for both professors and students alike. From the plain-speaking, nearly Asimovian clarity of Walter Piston's Orchestration, to the more measured approach of Kent Kennan's The Technique of Orchestration, all the way up to Samuel Adler's scholarly, if humane, The Study of Orchestration. Alfred Blatter's tome, Instrumentation and Orchestration, has long been lauded as the ultimate reference, with strong competition from the recent Cambridge Guide to Orchestration. Gordon Jacobs' orchestral technique has been used for nearly a century as a source of exercises and assignments for college students. And along those lines, William Lovelock's extraordinary updating of the same approach in his rare but worthy text, The Elements of Orchestral Arrangement, if you can find a copy. As for extended writings on the structure and artistry of orchestration, one might look no further than Norman Delmar's witty thesis, Anatomy of the Orchestra. But to stop there would be to miss George Frederick Mackay's creative orchestration and Alan Belkin's artistic orchestration. I start my foreword thus, not to exhaust the reader's patience with my niche expertise on the subject of orchestration books, but merely to put forth that many more or less up-to-date manuals, guides, and essays exist, which can be trusted to impart a reliable description of the orchestrator's basic toolkit. From the information in the above books, nearly all still in print, one absorbs a familiarity of the orchestra and the repertoire as it is seen today. Combined with the guidance of instructors, the patience of qualified musicians, the indulgence of conductors, and a firm grounding in the orchestral masterpieces of the great composers, the developing orchestrator may, with lengthy creative effort, build toward an approach creditable for both its craft and artistry. But this doesn't guarantee a depth of knowledge reaching back into the height of eras in which orchestration was a fertile, evolving craft, made ever more exciting with the advances in instrument building and the ever-increasing technical prowess of section players. Initially, orchestration was learned through participation as a musician and conductor, and through the direct study of orchestral scores, plus reference to some ancient and often unreliable reference works. Then came Berlioz, with his 1843 lightning stroke of the Grand Treatise on Instrumentation, written only a decade after he unleashed Symphonie Fantastique upon the unsuspecting world. To study both works is to be swept back to a time when the possibilities seemed endless, and those with the necessary talent, creative energy, and power of will seemed guaranteed to succeed as they enlarged that world. Berlioz hurls himself at his subject, not only outlining the properties and techniques of each standard orchestral instrument, but also throwing in the kitchen sink with enthusiastic details of instruments that he himself was never to score, like tenorune, alto ophicleide, saxo tromba, really saxo anything, and who could blame him for the latter? And yet for all his, at times, overweening grandeur, his book is nevertheless filled with sensible advice, intelligently organized, with plentiful excerpts poetically described to give the reader a taste of the necessary artistic effect of a passage, as it might relate to any question of craft. Through it all, Berlioz the showman never fails to entertain, with a lively, engaging writing style. In short, he wrote the kind of book that he himself wouldn't be bored reading, a salutary example that the best of orchestration text writers have followed according to their own inspirations. For indeed, Berlioz's Grand Treatise is the tallest and earliest giant upon whose shoulders all subsequent orchestration texts have stood. Not only those esteemed volumes I mentioned at the start, but a flood of manuals and dissertations from the middle of the 19th century to the dawn of the 20th. On that lively, if dated, shelf of writings, you'll find the widely, sometimes not safe for work, stand-up routine of Cecil Forsyth, the overwhelmingly creative yet incomplete vision of Rimsky-Korsakov, the scientifically measured calculations of Charles-Marie Widor, and many other books by authors now forgotten, like Ernest Guiraud, Hamilton Clark, Richard Hoffman, Solomon Yadison, and so on, each updating and making more relevant, more comprehensible, and often more economical the approach of Berlioz. And then, there's François-Auguste Gevaert's new treatise on instrumentation, possibly the most practical, usable classic work of instrumentation for today's orchestrators, especially in this current edition and translation by Davis Brown. And why would that possibly be? Perhaps it's in Gevaert's approach. As a composer, music critic, and firebrand, Berlioz had enormous insight, but he lacked the constant day-to-day, year-to-year experience of creating orchestrators from the ground up. But from Gevaert's first page of writing on violin, he reflects such experience, with brief to-the-point details on technique, building on concept after concept in a way that's both systematic and convincing. Each new aspect builds inexorably toward a holistic vision of violin technique, so that by the time the reader turns to a study of the repertoire, their perceptions are broadened to a deeper understanding. Such is the intention of any well-written manual, but there's an extra cachet of artistic heritage and insight built into each chapter of this book. And that's an insight that can be turned to our own advantage, a century and a half after its publication. To Gevaert, Beethoven's greatest works were written within his own century, and he quotes passages with the kind of insight that would be helpful not to just one of his students, but also to a conductor of any era. He knows the works of Meyerbeer from back to front, and explores many excerpts of unusual and, for that time, groundbreaking uses of certain techniques and combinations. His readers of today will be made familiar with the works of Halévy, Boieldieu, Ambroise Thomas, and many others at their best and most relevant pages according to Gevaert's keen order of study. His sense of organization is thorough to a fault, starting with chapters probably less interesting to modern readers on classification of instruments through their manner of tone production, followed by a discussion of the general ranges of instruments. While some of this may seem a bit dry, don't miss his outline on the overall range of musical sounds and how they relate to the natural voices of singers. Upon that early understanding of pitches, our entire system of Western music was founded, so using them as a benchmark and comparative timbral quality gives Gevaert a way into the usability and characteristics of each instrument, not to mention their relationship to one another. The real nitty-gritty starts in Chapter 3, with the aforementioned pages on violin, which is used as the exemplar of technique for the whole string section, after which each successive member is considered in comparison, stronger or weaker according to their attributes. There are sentences here worthy of framing, such as,
"In a variety of timbres, the cello cedes nothing to the violin. It unifies the characters of the three male voices, the fervent youthfulness of the tenor, the virility of the baritone, the austere roughness of the bass."
Exactly spot on. His place in time shows that the concert world had only recently abandoned three-string double basses, and here he underlines this abandonment is complete and irrevocable. In sum total, while his writings on strings are nowhere as detailed in extremis as Adler, he still outdoes Piston and Kennan in his discussion of the practicalities of string technique, not to mention copiousness of examples. Then Gevaert turns to winds, an even more glorious treasure chest of observations and perspectives. His exposition of their general characteristics is as clear and concise as one could fit into 10 pages plus diagrams, covering history, tone production, timbre, finger technique, and transposition systems. The world-weariness with which he addresses the transposition system by going back to the beginnings of history may not convince the perennial anti-transposition absolutist, but it comes from a place that many orchestration teachers will recognize after being challenged frequently over a perfectly usable and logical system. Then the quotable quotes come thick and fast as he moves through flutes to double reeds to single reeds.
"Both oboes and bassoons belong to the same section, conical bore double reed. This is why they are habitually considered to be a single family. But this approach does not square with the special meaning attached to the word family."
I'm delighted to see that even in the late 19th century, the ability of a player of the standard model to take on related auxiliaries was the foundation of what constituted an instrumental family, rather than just similarity of tone production. Of contrabassoon,
"The masters sometimes have it doubling contrabass lines that are quite busy. But it is doubtful that the contrabassoon has ever played these passages as cleanly as desirable, and in such case, one would do well to give the wind instrument a simplified version."
Absolutely. And then, when discussing the B-flat clarinet,
"This is the clarinet par excellence, that of virtuosi. Its tone realizes eminently the main quality of the instrument, pure and penetrating."
confusingly, he uses the C clarinet as the exemplar for the family, probably due to its lack of transposition. But he does make it clear that this model is essentially outdated, as does editor Davis Brown, and that the B-flat and A models represent the current and final standard. The section on brass, while less well organized according to today's standard, is still essential for understanding how the section was evolving right up to and past Gevaert's day. His strategy, imitated without thanks or acknowledgement by Forsyth, is to launch into a discussion of natural, or simple, horns and trumpets. While those older types of instruments are now mostly used for period performances only, I would say that this is one of the strongest chapters in the book, perhaps even one of the clearest and most understandable explications of the parts we see in scores from Bach to Brahms. What's a little less appetizing from there is his breakdown of transpositions, valve systems, harmonic positions, going on for quite a few pages, until the casual reader might have had quite enough before getting to the actual modern instruments, which are then constantly back-referenced in their ranges and abilities to the less digestible pages. But this should be no problem for the dedicated student of orchestration, especially one also intent on a career in conducting band instruments, of which Gevaert gives far more than just a nod. It's an indication of the times, just like his serious acknowledgement of the valve trombone, ubiquitous in that era, not to mention his perception of the tuba as a form of valved bugle. Throughout all of this, Gevaert is careful to mention the odd sock drawer, containing the viola d'amore, the mandolin, the ophicleide, and more. Where Forsyth dealt such miscellanea tongue-in-cheek quips, Gevaert is less indulgent and more realistic. He gives the reader enough information to get started, or at least to understand the process of the player if conducting them. Occasionally he's more incautiously dismissive than open-minded.
The harp, he claims, with its percussive and dry sound, is hardly a singing instrument.
There are few French composers of the following generation who might agree with that claim or characterization. He admits a few pages later that
its dominant character is idle and otherworldly. The harp sound transports the spirit far away from the tumultuous bustle of earthly passions, to places of serenity where calm and peace reign with force and majesty.
This is only revealing his era as he continues.
The harp, so often used in opera of our time, remains excluded from the symphony orchestra.
Gevaert could not imagine the extensive use of harp as it was to arise in many symphonies, tone poems, and suites within a generation. Of course, he often guesses wrong.
As for the piano, the powerful agent of the European arts' propagation to all peoples of the globe, it does not play much of a role in the orchestra. When it does appear, it is to assume the role of soloist.
The Russians, and then Americans and Germans, would soon change this perception. And yet he often guesses right in his aspirations, speaking with ardent optimism about the possible revival of the oboe d'amore, and might have found its recurrence in post-romantic works gratifying. And like many other Romantic composers, he saw the potential in saxophones, and devotes several pages to their ranges and transposition, though very little to their timbral qualities, and the unique characteristics that might make them useful to his students. Of course, Gevaert isn't immune to the occasional outrageous assertion, often as overcaution or lack of comprehension of an instrument's potential. Here are some of my favorites.
The viola does not offer that wonderful variety of timbres that has made the violin the universal interpreter of feelings. It lacks brilliance, passion, and virility. Situated at the edge of the male and female voices, the viola has an indecisive, mongrel-like character.
There are few listeners of any of the great solo viola repertoire who would agree to this, even that written in Gevaert's day, such as Rolla's Idylls. Another caustic gem.
The piccolo has none of the poetic gentleness that distinguishes the flute. Its extremely high pitch and lack of flexibility makes it unsuitable for expressive melodies.
As Gevaert deplored the lower register of the piccolo as
too weak in tone to be much use.
Such an observation is scarcely surprising. But of course that attitude has been disproven many times over. The reader will also find in these pages claims that
reed instruments are better at expressing states of pain than sentiments of joy,
and that
the bassoon's middle register has a tone that is quite voluminous, yet limp and soft.
Of course, all this shows his own personal moorings as an artist, for who could deny the merry bubbling of many an oboe passage, or the full-throated richness of a well-played bassoon solo? For all that, what makes this book so readable and so essential as a classic text is Gevaert's writing style, combined with a sense of knowing competence that's hard to argue against for its time. In passages of technical description, he's down-to-earth and economical, rather than dull and trivial, very much in the same vein as Berlioz. But I would say in some ways better, as there's a certain roll of the tongue, well translated and shaped by editor Davis Brown, that makes many simple statements and prescriptions memorable and flowing. And yet Gevaert is moved to flights of poetry in his descriptions of an orchestral passage's artistic qualities, also rivaling his august forebear.
In Act 3 of Gounod's Faust, the garden scene, when Marguerite opens the window and confides the secret of her desperate love to the night echoes, the crystalline note of the flute's high register seems to reflect the soft starlight, discreetly illuminating the mysterious concert of the sounds of nature.
Such sentences probably helped ensure that his readers back then would not fail to attend a performance or rehearsal of the work, score in hand, waiting eagerly for each such moment of musical ecstasy. He also shows a deep appreciation for certain instruments approaching elegiacs.
No other instrument than the horn acts so powerfully upon the listener's fantasy. The sounds of the horn carry the spirit away to domains of freedom, within vast forests, under the shade of ancient oaks, or into fairyland or dreamland, to the edge of clear fountains, where beautiful summer nights carry the mysterious notes of Oberon's horn.
Another characteristic Gevaert shares with his fellow orchestration mavens is a sense of good humor and occasional giddy slyness. Referring to past eras before the advent of well-trained musicians from conservatories,
Previously, when violists were drawn from the trash heap of violinists, it was imprudent to rely on them even for somewhat difficult passages.
he somewhat hilariously throws up his hands at the futility of describing the viola d'amour's technique. And when it comes to the explosion of weird brass and wind instruments in his day, he writes,
We do not intend to list everything that has been produced in this genre for the last half-century. There are many stillborn creations, unoriginal experiments, and novelties that were in vogue for but an hour.
He could also cast a bit of genteel shade on his contemporaries.
Of all the modern composers, Berlioz is the one who uses timpani most extensively. But, we can surely prophesy, it is not for this that his works will live for posterity.
Of course, Berlioz might well agree, and grant the fairness of such a comment, after his own wry remarks considering Beethoven's scoring. All these moments of wit, vexation, sublimity, and good solid advice for the late 19th century orchestrator await the readers of this book today. In knowing what he knew back then, my perception of the works of that era and the one before it become more clear to me, and I hope to you as well. And yet there's another aspect here, in that the advice you may glean from a contemporary manual may be much more memorably, more fluidly illustrated in some of these pages, with more generous, and sometimes more apt, musical examples. That all comes from a master educator whose passion was undimmed by years of instruction, whose sword of incisiveness all the more tempered, flexible, and sharp thereby. That this edition is now available between two covers bodes well for the quality of orchestration we're to hear in coming years. Wow, I really went on and on there, but this book totally merits the praise and commentary. In a lot of ways, it supersedes Berlioz's original treatise. At least if you were a student back then, and you were likely to only read one orchestration text during your conservatory training. As it is now, it really sums up a lot of the information that other authors were putting into their orchestration manuals around this time. If you're a classic orchestration book geek, then you'll see just how much Gevaert improves on the books that came before him, and how much other writers imitated his approach after him. But the best part of the book is how it reflects the temperament and outlook of French opera composing in that era, and it really shows how many lessons one can learn from those scores even today. There are a couple other significant books recently released that I'll try to feature in this series over the next few months, so I hope to see you back again with another great book to add to your shelves.